So in the introduction to The Lies That Bind, you say, on the one hand, that there's no dispensing with identities, but we need to understand them better if we can hope to reconfigure them and free ourselves from mistakes about them that are often a couple of 100 years old. So I think you've already covered some of these mistakes, but why can't we dispense with identities?
Well, one reason is I think that they're deeply entrenched in basic psychological mechanisms, which are extremely hard to imagine undoing in ways consistent with treating children with love and care and respect, because children spontaneously categorize people. It doesn't matter how hard you try to, they do it. Now, maybe that's a fact. That doesn't prove the truth of a counterfactual claim that if we all radically behave differently, they wouldn't be able to escape from it. But given the way people actually mostly do behave, trying to raise children without any identity categories, and in particular without the ones that are important in the social life around them, like race and gender, I think it's just not possible psychologically. So as it were, there they are. But what the history teaches is they can be reconfigured quite radically. That's the brilliant thing that the trans movement has done, is to, piggybacking on the work of feminists on gender more widely, they've gotten most of us to reconfigure our notions of gender in such a way that they fit more happily into the world. That seems to me, that's a social achievement. It's also an intellectual achievement. It's a conceptual achievement. It's a philosophical, it's a piece of successful conceptual engineering, and it's been carried out over a relatively short period of time. So that's that's great, I think. So one reason we can't get rid of them is that I don't know how to do it. I literally don't know how we would do it, even if we wanted to. But here's the second reason. I don't think we should necessarily want to. The word identity in this sense, right, isn't used before. I can't find a usage of this word before 1940, before the Second World War, literally. You on Google now, Google Books, you can look through all the classics of sociology, it doesn't take many weeks, and just type in identity. And of course the word occurs meaning something else. It doesn't occur in this sense. And the person who gave it greatest prominence probably was Erik Erikson, another Cambridge resident like you, who wrote a lot of books with the word identity in the title and invented the concept of the identity crisis and used it to think about historical figures like Martin Luther, but also in a psychiatric way. I think there is a reason why it took off. Because there were what we call identities before. It wasn't that they weren't there, it's just that they weren't talked about. Of course, people had genders and races and nationalities and religions before 1945. The world would have been very different without them as categories before 1945. And the Second World War might not have happened without them. So why did people, well, Erikson makes a suggestion, which I don't think is quite right, but he's right that they've come to be more important for urban, industrialized, modern societies. And I think that's not surprising once you think about it, because people, what is the most striking difference between my circumstances and the circumstances of my grandparents or great-grandparents in England and in Ghana? They typically spent most of their lives bumping into a very small number of people about whom they knew a lot. They were village people, as it happens, my ancestors back then. And most people in most of history were like that. Most human beings were in tiny bands, and they knew, they knew what age group everybody belonged to. They knew when it was time for them to go through the rites of circumcision or whatever it was that transitioned them into manhood. They knew all that about everybody in the village, as it were. And so they didn't need categories that allow you to manage social relations with huge numbers of strangers. And if you are going to manage social relations with huge numbers of strangers, it is useful to have what can turn out to be unhelpful, namely stereotypes, but patterns of ways of interacting with people on the basis of an assignment of them to a small set of categories that are widely understood in the society to affect how you should treat people. So when I was growing up in Ghana, it was the case that men opened doors for women. And they didn't just open doors for women whose names they knew, they'd open doors for random women, any old woman. You're entering the store, woman gets there, you open the door. At least if you were properly raised, that's what you did. Now, there are disadvantages. I picked that example because it has disadvantages as well as advantages. The disadvantages are that it regularly inscribes in people the thought that women need doors opening for them, which they don't. They're not physically incapable of opening doors, and it's condescending. But so that's why a lot of work had to go into reshaping gender conventions. And we're not finished. But it is useful to have these large categories that we can use for sort of interacting with strangers. And the most important use for them, I think, is that we can't live in organized political communities that are small enough to be constituted as fundamentally face-to-face communities. Aristotle thought that, I think he thought that 10,000, or was it 9,999, was about as citizens, so also plus and wives and slaves and so on. But he didn't think that you could run a society unless, as he said, each citizen could know the character of the others. We couldn't divide the human population into groups of that size and run the world. So we need politics above the scale of the polis. And to do politics above the scale of the polis, you have to be thinking of other people, at least some of the time, as fellow somethings, fellow Americans this week, because we just elected a new president. That activity of electing a president makes no sense unless somebody thinks that they're Americans and that matters. You need an American identity just to get to the business of voting. Never mind getting to the business of trying to build a healthcare system that will serve everybody, which you also need it for. So I think we need, and precisely because they're going to be used on this large scale, they're going to be rough and ready, they're going to be a little bit incoherent, they're going to involve projections of things that aren't really there, because if you take the philosopher's thought that it's all more complicated than you at first thought into the public world, it just messes everything up. So we need, and no, book before last of mine was about idealization. We need idealizations. We need to use simplified models in everything. We use them in physics and we need them in social life. And so the lies that are built into these identities are objectionable, not because they're lies, but because the particular lies that they are doing damage. We can't have a perfect, one of the advantages of the nominalist picture is it allows you to see that a label can be useful, even if people are using it a bit sloppily, and that forcing them to try and use it more precisely is just a waste of time, right? Because the job they're doing doesn't require them to be right, other than sloppy. So I think that recognition that they need to be, that the sloppiness is fine, but not if it's doing harm. And a lot of the sloppiness is doing harm. It's propagating falsehoods about intelligence and race, or about imagination and gender and all sorts of stuff that's getting in the way of people living useful, productive lives, flourishing, having eudaimonia. So that's how I think about it, that they can be instruments of eudaimonia. For me, the great model of this, of course, is the difference between the way Ghanaians think about nationalism and the way Germans think about nationalism. I grew up in a country with a father who was fighting for the independence of our nation. Nationalism for me is a fantastically positive thing. It's what made Queen Elizabeth our ex-queen. And something that I believe the British could learn from the Ghanaians. But the Germans, with their history of 20th century nationalism, of course, think of nationalism as a bad thing. My view is it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's a thing you can do good or bad with. And the right task, the project, is to reshape these things, not to make them precise, but to make them useful. Usable for the things that they're useful for. And so now, is race going to turn out in the long run, so the social category, is it going to turn out in the long run to be useful for all human societies? I doubt it. It wasn't used much before the 18th century anywhere, anything like this notion. Of course, people had ideas about kinds of people, but not the idea of kinds of people defined by sort of bodily something or other. It starts a bit earlier because it begins probably with the development of anti-Semitism in Spain at the so-called Reconquest. But so 15th century, but not before that. Different things are going on, and so if human beings can live for most of human history without race, we can probably live in the future without it if we choose. We're nowhere near to the point where we can do that for lots of reasons. But I'm imagining I feel it happening. Thomas Chatterton Williams feels to me like the advance guard of the future, not some crazy idealist. Now, this is not a popular thought. There are lots of people who want to hold on to racial identities for dear life. And that may be because in the circumstances in which they are living, they are useful organizing categories for doing work that they want to do. And I don't deny that. I'm not making a claim about that. I'm making a claim about the remote future. Right. But I don't think in the remote future there won't be, as long as there are human beings in large numbers, I don't believe we'll be able to do without some of these simplifying, but also potentially unifying categories of social life.
Could I just, I have to let you go, but let me just ask a quick follow-up on that. So granted that we need these rough and ready categories to classify our fellows, American, veteran, disabled, tall, short, white, black, man, woman, whatever. Just that thought gives you surely only a very thin notion of identity, because of course I could agree that that I am old or disabled or white or whatever, without in any substantial sense identifying as old or white or whatnot.
Correct, but it wouldn't be much use to you if you didn't identify. Just conceding that I have an American passport isn't enough to get me to vote. In other words, simply granting that the label applies isn't. I agree that's a thin thought, but that isn't the thought, because that thought won't get you healthcare for either for the disabled or for the American. And it won't get you pensions for the old. So I think, in other words, to speak more precisely, and I mean, it's a good question. I would say we need identities that are mobilizable for solidarity, and that requires something more than the mere concession that the label applies to me. I have to look at myself in the mirror in the morning and think, good morning, you fine black man, or good morning, you fine trans woman, or you fine philosophy professor. These are categories. I mean, when somebody asks me if I'm a philosopher, they're not asking me what it says on the label of the department. And if that were what they're asking me, they could find out for themselves. They want to know whether I think of myself as a philosopher and whether I ever do things because I think it's the sort of thing that a philosopher ought to do. Right. And I do. It's not the case I do everything, because I think it's the sort of thing a philosopher ought to do. But there are a lot of things I spend my time doing that I wouldn't do if I didn't think of myself as a philosopher. And I could be in the department and do my job and not do lots of those things.
Right. Okay. Well, that seems a particularly appropriate point at which to end. So,
well, thanks.
Because you certainly did your job today, that's for sure.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I did my job. I didn't do my job today because I think there isn't an ethicist column in today's Sunday Times because I don't, for some reason, in the perfect bound issues, I don't get asked to write. It's very weird. I don't know why it is.
Thanks again, anyway.
Okay,
thank you.
All right, thank you.